to welcome everyone to tonight's Citizens Climate University webinar. It's Progressive Messaging, Communicating Effectively with the Left, and we're lucky to have two of our very own CCL All-Stars on the line as our experts. I'll introduce Carla first. Carla Wise is a PhD and an environmental writer and climate solutions activist. Previously, she trained and worked as a plant conservation biologist and is currently a chapter co-lead, congressional liaison, and progressive outreach action team lead for Citizens Climate Lobby. In 2016, this is a little bonus piece of knowledge, she published her first book, Awake on Earth, Facing Climate Change with Sanity and Grace. And she lives in Corvallis, Oregon with her 18-year-old daughter. If you have any questions at the end about her book especially, I know Carla would love to answer those. And also on the line tonight, we have Gary Rucinski, who is CCL's Massachusetts State Coordinator. After co-founding a software startup, Gary became convinced that the free market could contribute significantly to mitigating climate change. In 2011, he founded CCL's Boston chapter, and in 2014 and 15, he was the Northeast Regional Coordinator. Gary holds a PhD in physics from the University of Rochester and a BA from Brandeis, and is currently working as a software project manager at the MIT Linking Laboratory. We're very grateful to have both of you on the line tonight, and thank you for leading our workshop. I'm just going to go over a quick review of what we're hoping everyone can walk away with tonight learning, and then I'll pass the baton over to Carla. So if you're tuning in over the phone or online, tonight's learning goals hopefully will encompass the following. After tonight's lesson, volunteers will be more effectively able to communicate with and listen to our friends on the left. We'll be able to understand the theory of the progressive worldview and incorporate those values into our discussions, and to demonstrate successful listening and communication skills in practice conversations. So without further ado, I'll hand it over to you, Carla.
Thank you. Welcome, everybody. Thank you for being here on this summer evening. So there's three things we hope to do tonight. First is really just to go back briefly to liberal and conservative morality and something about the differences between the way liberals and conservatives tend to view the world. Secondly, we're going to spend the bulk of the time on talking about what tends to work. And this is trial and error. This is gathered from folks within CCL that, like Danny Richter and others who've given advice, and just I've sort of been trying to gather lots of nuggets of what seems to work and use my own experience to put this together. And then at the end, we're going to do a couple of skill building exercises about sort of working on communicating well, and particularly on listening well for those who are in the progressive community who often do have some real issues with our approach. So that's what we're going to do. This is something I like to start out with when I talk about communicating with progressives, because it really has been very instrumental in my thinking about why so often I have a hard time with meetings with liberal members of Congress, with going out and talking to liberals in my community, with it seems like CCL should be a natural fit, and yet often there's all this skepticism that's voiced. And this really helped me a lot to understand for myself why this is happening. So Jonathan Haidt came out with this very interesting way of looking at it, which has to do with interviewing thousands and thousands and thousands of people. So it's data-based, and essentially what he found was that people sort of create their morality based on 6 different moral foundations: authority, respect, sanctity, purity, loyalty to your in-group, liberty and freedom, fairness and reciprocity, and care and harm. Now, the most interesting thing is that although all 6 of these in different amounts tend to matter to those that label themselves, self-identify as conservatives, those who self-identify as progressives or as liberals generally really care most about fairness and about care and harm. And things like loyalty to your in-group, authority and respect, those other 4 things really don't measure up much for progressives when it comes to deciding what's right and wrong. So anyway, we're going to move on, but just keep that in the back of your head as we talk about what tends to be a problem for progressives about what we do. So the next piece is really talking about what works with progressives. And again, I want to reiterate that this is not really mine. I've borrowed and I've borrowed and I've stolen and I've put this together and I've used some of my own experience, but I feel like mostly this is based on things I've learned from others within CCL. So yeah, with that caveat, these are the 5 things that I want to talk about briefly, things that have worked a lot for a lot of people. Number 1, becoming a trusted messenger, and we'll talk about what that means and why. Listening is number 2. And this really is about listening for values, and we talk about this a lot within CCL, but it's just as important with those on the left as it is with everybody. Number 3 is really important in my experience for success with progressives is that that progressives and left-leaning people are in general incredibly discouraged overall, but particularly about our chances for containing climate change. And a lot of what you tend to get back from progressives when you try to talk to them about climate change is a sense of hopelessness. And I feel that this is something that is a bigger obstacle than we really realize when working with progressives, and we need to find ways to address it. Number 4, focus on the progressive impact of carbon fee and dividend, and I'll talk about what that means. And then finally, number 5, be very careful with the language that you use with progressives. Some of CCL's canned language is language that we use all the time without us realizing it is turning progressives off. And I want to talk a little about that. So this is number 1, becoming a trusted messenger. We decide right away based on our intuition and our first take how we feel about people. That's just what humans do. We're not logical. We're driven by our emotions and our intuitions. So even if you're talking to someone for a very short time, they're going to have an impression about you, and how they feel about you is going to have a huge impact on whether they'll listen to you. This is something you may have heard directly from you know, a lot of CCL events, but I just want to reiterate it. One thing I try to do when I talk to progressive audiences, or really when I talk to everybody, but especially progressives, is I try to find ways to introduce myself that they're going to relate to. And what I often start with is talking about my sort of aha moment where I really switched from a conservation biologist who was mostly, you know, working on small projects having to do with plant conservation, to realizing that I needed to devote a really large part of my life to trying to fight climate change. And so sometimes I talk about this trip that I took with my family to Costa Rica in 2006. When we got to Costa Rica, the entire population of Costa Rica, from what I could tell, was talking about the changing climate. And for those of you who are old enough to remember in detail what it was like in 2006 in the US, you know what a contrast that was. And it really stunned me. I just couldn't believe how everybody understood there that the climate was changing. They were talking about the impacts. They were talking about, this is a guide that we had through the cloud forests who told us exactly what had been changing in the cloud forests and why. And then we got home and I was kind of stunned by the information that I was reading that was coming from Jim Hansen, where he had just published this paper about his essentially stating that he thought we had about 10 years to reverse emissions, and if we didn't do it, we were going to tip the climate into a new and very scary kind of climate that was not going to be amenable to human life. So those two things for me really changed everything. And if you have a similar story, or even if you don't have a similar story, whatever your story is, I recommend that you try to start with it, because people want to know, and they want to know whether they can trust you. Okay, so number 2, listen. Progressives are not a monolithic thing. Progressives are as individual as any other group of people that you're going to come across. And there are a lot of reasons that progressives are suspicious of CCL. And I'm going to list here some of them that I've run across, but there's more. These are just my top ones. And if you let progressives talk to you and you really listen, you will figure out pretty quickly which of these might apply. But many times people on the left either don't trust markets or they don't understand markets. And so when you say a market, friendly or a market-driven approach, that is immediately suspicious to many progressives. So that's number 1. Number 2, many are against the idea of revenue neutrality at the beginning, or even hold on to that. They want that money to be used for things that they believe in. Number 3, they align with frontline communities and seek only climate solutions that address environmental justice concerns. And if you're interested in this piece of it, the place for you is really the environmental justice action team. Progressive doesn't focus on this area, but I'm just bringing it up here because it's one of the reasons that progressives can be suspicious of what we're doing. The next one is the idea that nuclear power should just be taken off the table. And then finally, another another stumbling block with progressives really is that some just believe it's not ever going to be possible to work with Republicans. And I've had that issue with my own member of Congress. So, and then finally, with the care harm question that progressives find a very strong pillar of their morality, some really feel that their concern about the poor sometimes overshadows their concern about climate change. This is something that for me, I have a difficult time addressing because I feel like climate change is first and foremost going to hurt the poorest people among us all around the world. And so I always want to say, well, if you're concerned about the poor, then we need to solve climate change yesterday. But that arguing in that way, of course, is not effective. You really have to have a much more thorough conversation, but that's one that's come up a lot. Okay, so in order to get at what your progressives' concerns are, you have to really talk to them and listen to what their concerns are. Number 3, the sharing optimism and the left needs hope. I think anyone on this call who's really spent much time, who either is progressive or is someone who considers themselves part of the left or spends a lot of time with those people, knows that this is a very bleak, there's a very bleak mood. There already was in terms of climate change, and then after this election, it's become even a more serious hurdle. So my approach to this, and this is kind of a personal choice about how to deal with this particular issue with progressives, but my approach is that I really try very hard to share the information that most progressives don't know that does give me optimism. First of all, again and again, I've spoken with progressives, with liberals, with, even my members of Congress who are unaware of everything good that has been going on, that we've been working on. They don't know about the Climate Solutions Caucus, or they don't know about its growth. They don't know about the Climate Leadership Council proposal, the Republican climate resolution. There's just, because our country is so divided, we don't know what's going on the quote other side. And so a lot of times just sharing the information that you have that keeps you at this is a super powerful tool. Then also, again and again, I've gone into congressional meetings and found that, or other places and given talks and found that people don't understand that we lobby Republicans all the time. That's what we do. And we have good meetings with them, and we make progress, and we're nonpartisan. And this is actually very powerful for many people who feel like they could never talk to a Republican member of Congress. Optimism, I want to stress this, does not mean pretending that this is not serious. It does not mean pretending that, you don't feel just as worried about it as you do. But it does mean that you need to find a way to limit the doom talk, because that just doesn't lead to action, and offer people opportunities to take action. And I think in order to spread optimism, you need to believe there's still a pathway to a stable climate. And I think to be part of CCL, you need to believe that. So I don't think that's a big stretch, but I think that has to be real for you, and you need to share it. Okay, there's a bunch of things I do in my talks to try to share optimism, in various ways. I talk about the flattening of global emissions. I talk about the fall of prices in solar and in wind and other renewables, and go ahead and next slide. This is a slide from 2016 showing solar panel installation and cost. And there's a whole bunch of other things. You can show the Climate Solutions Caucus growth. You can show CCL's growth. Anyway, I tend to do that more in my talks now, particularly since the election. I feel like people really need that. Okay, number 4 for progressives, talk about the impact of carbon fee and dividend across incomes. This is something I think we don't tend to do because, in my opinion, we don't tend to do it because we're afraid of scaring Republicans. I don't know if that's the reason we don't do it, but I know that it's one of our most powerful sort of tools in explaining to progressives why we feel that our proposal will not hurt the poor. So I'm assuming, you know, the left, again, values fairness, values caring for the most vulnerable. So, you know, we have two really good studies that show that that fee and dividend does a good job of protecting lower income households from economic harm under our proposal. Use that data. Look at these studies for the impacts in your congressional district if you're talking to your congressperson or people in your district. And then consider using the wording that our proposal has a net, economically has a net progressive effect. In other words, it's gonna help lower income people economically more than it will help people on the higher end of the income scale. And then another thing that I think maybe Marty Roach from the Environmental Justice Group talked about using this wording. If we share the dividend equally, then most Americans, particularly low and middle income Americans, will come out even or ahead. And that's why the monthly dividend is so important. Find language that you can use and then use it. This is just something I assume many of you have seen from the household impact study. Those on the highest, the top 2% have by far the largest carbon footprint. The first quintile or the lowest income folks have by far the smallest, and it goes up from there. Next slide. And so therefore, the mean benefit for the first quintile is, you know, 87% come out ahead, and for the very highest income among us, we're not going to have a net benefit, but of course the percent of income that it's going to represent for those high income people is vanishingly small. Okay, so finally, I just want to talk a little bit about language and about CCL language and language you might want to be aware of. So I talked about how, in my experience, progressives don't trust markets or don't understand markets. Oh, this is the first thing. All households is going to be a better, I think, better word choice for your progressive audiences. Okay, then as far as markets, market-based, market-friendly, or free market solutions, that's an immediate turnoff to many people on the left. Now, I know that's language we use all the time, but I would say that if you're talking to someone who you consider to be very left-leaning, I would say that the wording corrective to the market is going to be a whole lot more palatable. People on the left believe, in general, I hate to throw out all these big generalizations, but in general, they believe that we need a transformation. And so talking about the transformative power of a rising carbon fee, that this alone really can have make a huge transformation in our energy system, is a good thing. You know, and then this is just another way of talking about fairness to the lower income people among us, that they have the most to gain from a quick transition off of fossil fuels because they are going to be hurt the most from climate change. Okay, and another possible thing to use is the idea that pollution should not be free. This is not something that is going to work with all audiences, or it might not be comfortable for you, but it's something that's come up as wording that progressives sometimes relate to. This is just a summary slide of what we just talked about. And then a final note, if you're giving a talk to people on the left, don't just use George Shultz or a conservative economist as your spokesperson. They're not going to like that. So we have really good spokespeople from the left and the right, and I don't be shy about using those on the left. If you're talking to people on the left, we have Barack Obama. We have Pope Francis, who's become a real hero for a lot of people on the left. There's also quotes from Bill McKibben talking about how we need a price on carbon. I mean, and then finally, we have a long list of really well-respected Democratic members of Congress who have actually introduced carbon pricing in various ways. And this is and there's, Senator Sanders. I mean, so these are great tools, and we need to use them when we're talking to people on the left. Okay, so I guess let's move on to the skills.
That sounds great, Carla. We're right at the half-hour mark. This is a perfect transition. And what I'm actually going to do is put in the chat window the link to this document for everyone that's on the website or using Zoom on your computer, because when we break up in a little bit, Gary's going to lead us an activity, and then Carla is. You actually won't be able to see the slides in your small group. And so this document in the chat window, for all those that are on your computer, you can link up and see the same prompts that we're encouraging to talk about right now. So I'll pass it to you, Gary, and you can lead us in this first activity, if that's all right.
Okay, thanks. I was really glad that you reached out and asked me to speak tonight, because this is something I've been thinking about for a long time, being from Massachusetts with an all Democratic delegation. And so, in Massachusetts, we struggle to connect with our Democratic representatives and senators. And I think this progressive outreach is an important part of how we can make some progress. So in thinking about a breakout exercise, I think that we as CCLers really need to get into the habit of not bringing up the carbon tax in a first meeting with a Democratic member of Congress or aide or anyone from the established environmental community, unless of course we're asked. So in this exercise, we'll be practicing in pairs. One person as the congressional aide or our environmentalist friend, and the other as a CCLer, whose role during the 2 minutes is to engage the first person in a dialogue seeking to understand what climate policy solutions they hold as most important. In essence, the goal of this initial exercise is to listen and repeat back what you've heard to the first person for the 2 minutes without bringing up carbon taxes or fee and dividend. Sample questions might include, many observers believe that prospects for any climate legislation passage are dismal. What is your preferred approach to addressing climate change? What constituencies and values are important to you to include in any climate policy solution? What parts of addressing climate change make you feel most optimistic right now, and which ones make you feel least optimistic? And Dwight Eisenhower said, if you can't solve a problem, enlarge it. Is there a larger problem or challenge that climate action might logically be connected to stimulate more dialogue and build a coalition around to increase chances of passage? This exercise will give attendees opportunities to weave in some of Carla's suggestions on the common ground language that they use during the discussion. Ultimately, we want you to be comfortable going into conversations with progressives where the discussion is all about the progressive point of view and not about being viewed as another opportunity to sell revenue neutral carbon tax. I think we are also practiced talking about carbon fee and dividend, that we tend to grow impatient, practicing the art of listening to other conventional approaches. I know I do that all the time whenever anybody starts talking about cap and trade or subsidies. I tend to want to jump to cut them off and rather than giving them an opportunity to speak. So this in turn leads our volunteers to never really take the opportunity to let others talk about their goals and beliefs. We need to do a better job of allowing this space if we want our progressive friends to trust us. They need to know that they have been heard before they will be able to hear our point of view. Pairs of volunteers should do the role play one way and then switch roles, and we'll come back together to compare notes about the experience.
So it's pretty straightforward. Gary's done a great job of outlining our goal. And again, that document that I posted in the chat window for everyone but the 2 people that are calling in should be available. Again, we're just going to practice listening and finding that common ground. And you can use some of those sample questions that are in that dialogue. I'm going to just automatically assign random pairs. If you happen to have a hard time, especially on the computer, getting a partner, you can raise your hand and I'll make sure to reassign. And I'll also give a warning at 2 minutes to make sure that you switch and have each of you have a chance to partner up and practice both listening and sharing. And then at the end of the 5 minutes, like Gary's notated, we'll make sure to actually bring people back together and process this. But for now, if it's all right, I'm going to click on create the breakout rooms. You'll have to accept it and click if you are on computer. If you're on the phone, it'll automatically put you in. And again, let me know if you're having issues and we'll bring you back here in about 5 minutes.
Okay, well, this is Larry Kramer, and I was talking to Tracy, and she lives in San Francisco, and she was very happy with the cap and trade system in California. So I just asked her what sort of features would she like to see in a perfect solution to climate change. We never talked about carbon fee and dividend.
Was it hard for you, Larry?
No, she's very easy to talk to.
Larry, did you find yourself wanting to jump in at all, or to either
Well, normally I do, but during this exercise, no, I didn't. You must have been good at training me because I didn't.
Anybody else who was playing the role of CCLer? And
I was a CCLer.
Mm-hmm. And did
Kathy with Abaya, and she also jumped into cap and trade, and I tried to find out whether there were things about cap and trade that she might not be enthusiastic about, but just when we were getting warmed up, it was time to switch.
This is Mary in Michigan. My partner was another Californian, and I'm glad for these questions because I realized sometime in the last couple months that I had not asked my member of Congress basically to start out what is his point of view about this issue. I've always gone in talking about carbon fee and dividend, and so I haven't had a chance to listen to his point of view other than the belief that the Republicans will never do anything.
That's great.
I think we've got time for at least one more. If any of you also want to share about your experience to Gary, we'll have at least one more chance to process before we switch to our second exercise.
Well, I almost got recruited for Move On there. Yeah, the plan was to pretty much take all the assets away from the fossil fuel companies. And that sounded good to me as far as a fairness issue, but I wasn't sure how it could happen.
You may have had somebody trying to give you a hard time to intervene there.
Yes, I think so, considering all the dark money.
That actually leads me to want to ask the question. This was another question I wanted to ask, which is, again, at playing the role of CCLer, was there anything new that you learned about alternative policies that that you didn't know before and that you did in fact find attractive? So taking all the assets away, that's one thing.
I think, I mean, you know, somebody liking cap and trade is good, but I think there are definitely problems with it relative to CFD. So I had to resist the temptation there.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not sure most of our progressives would know about would support cap and trade either.
Well, these are excellent processes, and just having a chance to, I think, really resist and have a humble attitude about realizing that we don't have the full market on knowledge is just a really important grounding. Gary, did you have anything else that you'd like to share before we pivot to the second of two exercises to help us wrap up?
Yeah, I want to play off of the comment that was made about not knowing what a particular member of Congress's point of view was because of always going in and selling fee and dividend. And one of the things I struggled with at the June conference was how was I going to conduct the meetings that I had with our Democratic members. And anybody who went to the conference knew that there was a lot of information about the Climate Solutions Caucus, the Climate Leadership Council, the number of new members on the Climate Solutions Caucus, I don't remember what some of the other news was that was going on. So, you know, there was a tendency to want to really, this is maybe putting it in politely, but hype that information to help push the sense of optimism that something could happen. And yet I knew that we were walking into some Democratic offices who were going to be very skeptical of any Republican movement because they would just be jaded or cynical about it and think that it was all, you know, a PR move. And so we, in fact, went into some meetings and we started with that. We simply presented, you know what, not in a very optimistic way, not in a very, you know, over the top way. We said, look, there's a couple of things going on. Here they are. What's your take on these? And the offices that we did that with, they all took that opportunity to vent about the, you know, obstructionism and the denialism and everything else. And I remember one phrase particularly, even about the Climate Solutions Caucus, that's very nice, but when it comes at the end of the day, which button are they pushing, red or green? You know, are they pushing the red button to vote down climate or environmental legislation, or are they pushing the green button to promote it? And thankfully, since the conference, of course, we have seen at least that one measure that was where they voted the right way. So, so I think, you know, that's my experience, and that's some of how it relates to the conversation that we're having tonight.
I think that's incredibly relevant, Gary, and especially with your wealth of background out east and really, you know, seeing throughout a lot of the New England states this dialogue happening. It's incredibly important, I think, that we acknowledge, you know, what CCL is trying to do in stitching both parties back together again, and how that then affects each of those parties. So thank you so much for sharing that. And I'll turn it back over to you, Carla, to lead our second activity.
Okay, thanks. So you want to change the slide, or there we go. Okay. I'm not totally clear on whether everybody can see this or not. Hello?
I think we can.
Okay, all right. So, and can you put up on the screen the 5? Okay, great. So basically what I'd like you to try to do in this exercise is to try being a person who has one of these objections, one of you. So pick one, and I actually would recommend, because this is progressive messaging and not the environmental justice, that you might want to pick one that isn't the aligning with frontline communities, but one of the other ones, and voice that to your partner in a way that, you know, so try to pick one that you can kind of agree with. And then the other person's job is to listen and then respond with a way, speaking that back, that shows that you heard them and that you understand what they're saying. So actively listen, person two actively listens, and then explain back to make sure that you've heard what the objection is. And then person one is then given a chance to sort of say, yeah, that's what I meant, or no, actually what I meant was this. And then the hard part, if you're a good listener, this part will be pretty easy. The hard part then is the last thing, is that the listening person then wants to try to formulate some kind of a response that both validates the objection and then says something about your reasoning for why you think that there's still some reasons to look at CCL's proposal, or maybe just explain something about your approach to that objection. That's the point that where if you've learned to listen, then there's this point where you acknowledge that you've listened, but you also say, yeah, I really understand that, and this is my take on it. So the idea here is to go back and forth twice. And the practicing in pairs in the blue box, I think, explains how to do that.
I love it. And at this point, we are mindful of the time. We want to have a chance to broaden the conversation as we return. So I'll pair people up again. You should have the same partner, and we'll bring you back in 5 minutes. So hopefully you have a chance to both practice this role. All right, here we go. We'll see you back in 5 minutes, everyone.
You know, we just have a few minutes left, and I really just want to give people a chance to, I really wanted some time for questions at the end too. So rather than focus on processing that, if you want to say something or ask a question as it relates to this whole workshop, I'd like to give you an opportunity.
I'm losing you. It looks like we're going back to the main room.
Yep, I think we're all back in the main room.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah. Thank you. It was good to talk to you.
So does anybody have a question that they'd like, a burning question that they'd like to have answered or addressed before we're done tonight?
And feel free to unmute yourself by clicking on that lower corner microphone icon if you're on the computer, or *6 if you're on the phone.
Hi, this is Abaya. I just want to thank you both so much, and Brett, for this great webinar. Oh, are we supposed to do this poll though now before I comment?
No, whenever. No, that's just happening at the same time. Keep on commenting. This is on the side.
Well, thank you both. I live in Virginia half-time, and they're about to do cap and trade. And frankly, I have to admit that cap and trade just makes the hackles on the back of my neck stick up. And I am beside myself at what's happening. And I have some very good allies who are helping us stop a pipeline. I don't know if I should name the group, but they're really pushing cap and trade here. And the whole city where I live seems to be cap and trade. So I hope that maybe you could, in future webinars, give us some more tools about cap and trade to talk to people about it. Thank you.
That's maybe a topic for a whole separate webinar.
Yeah.
I'll just say this, that our next month's lineup is all about policy comparisons and policy discussion and talking about each of the legs of the stool. I don't know if any of them will specifically be about comparing fee and dividend to cap and trade, but I'm sure that it'll at least dive into some of the rationale behind the efficiencies and, you know, the progressive values that fee and dividend can be grounded in. So keep your ears open.
All right. My partner, Kathy, said that she had heard an alternative to our policy proposal, and I'd never heard what she was talking about, and I hope they cover that option so that we learn more about it. It had something to do with percentages.
No, I was actually doing the even increments to everybody, and I used the fact that that meant that 1% of the money would go to the top 1%. 10% of the money would go to the top 10%, but 90% would go to the bottom 90% of people. So I was using it to show progressivity. So it is our proposal. It was our proposal. It was the equal amount. And I specifically compared it to doing tax swaps, which a lot of people think of as revenue neutrality.
Well, I know we only have about 1 minute left, so feel free to ask any other questions or provide comments for Carla and Gary here.
This is Larry Kramer, and the reason I called in was I actually met a Democrat one time, and their objection was they didn't understand how putting a price on carbon and giving it back to the consumers would lower carbon emissions.
Yes. I've had that happen too. And in that common objections of progressives where I said they don't trust markets, that it's actually, that issue is a lack of understanding of how markets work. And that is not an uncommon thing to have someone really not understand how it would work. The question comes up, well, if they're getting the money back, won't they just spend it on fossil fuels, right? And so then you really have to go to the very basics of basic economics and how people to choose the cheapest alternative. And I mean, I think the only way to sort of address that is to sort of go back to basics. And I've had to do that multiple times. But if you want to talk more about that, I'm happy to do that. And my email is at the end of this webinar on the last slide. So yeah, I know what you're talking about.
Actually, the presenters group has a good presentation that steps you through that.
Yep. Yeah, that's right. Absolutely. Well, I think we're kind of probably run out of time. So thank you everybody for being here, and thank you, Brett, for organizing these. And please join the Progressive Outreach Action Team if you're interested, or contact me if you're interested, or contact me if you want to reach out to Gary and you don't have his email address.
Yes, thank you so much. A big round of applause again to both Carla and Gary for your time tonight, and all of you for making time to jump in. The results of the feedback were wonderful. We're glad to hear that this met everyone's expectations. And again, if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to Carla's email there. I will post the recording as well as the slide deck if you're interested after tonight on CCU. Just look under the middle tab of the Learning Center for the prior lessons, and you'll be able to download it as of tomorrow. So have a wonderful night, everyone, and we'll see you soon, I am sure. Take care.
You too. Thank you. Good night.
Thank you.
Good night, everyone.
Bye.
Good night.
Good night.
Good night.